how we go recording it. I'm going to share my screen now, and well, actually, before I do, I think I'll just welcome everybody who's come. And there are people, as I say, from paediatric registrars and paediatric trainees, people doing their Diploma of Child Health and their Masters of Medicine, and from PNG, from Honiara, and from Vanuatu. So welcome you guys, but also welcome to the other people who've come on today. I give a talk like this every week, but today is a sort of special talk. It's really it's designed to be a practical teaching about oxygen therapy for the pandemic. And I'll just show my my slides and just show you why. I'll just then tell you why we're giving this particular talk. I hope you can all see my slides now. Look, as I say, welcome. And I was asked to give this talk last week by, and I gave it last week, Friday, by Scotty Candelio. And the reason to give this talk, I know many of you are experts in the use of oxygen, and but many health workers aren't. And I think it's our job, in a way, to become experts and to teach nurses and CHWs and HEOs and junior doctors about how to use oxygen properly. And I think you've all seen from time to time those really distressing images of people, families scrambling for oxygen in India and in Brazil, trying to find somewhere in the village or the streets oxygen therapy for their sick relatives. And about a year ago, we wanted to try to avoid that. And part of the way to avoid that is to buy a lot of oxygen concentrators. And in the last 6 months, we have managed to buy 320 oxygen concentrators with some funds from the World Bank and some help from DFAT. And those concentrators are now available for all the hospitals around the country, the provincial hospitals and the COVID treatment centres. And I think that not all staff are familiar in how to use oxygen concentrators, and but we have to be experts. And I wanted to try to run a teaching session today that will teach you how to be experts and also teach you how to be teachers in how to teach others how to use oxygen concentrators and pulse oximeters. So that's the background to the talk. That we want healthcare workers in PNG to be experts in oxygen therapy and the use of oxygen concentrators. So as I say, I gave this talk on Friday, and some of it is a bit has a bit of a flavour of adult medicine. And I think for most of our COVID preparations, we have to think about how to look after sick adults. So I'm going to be talking a bit about things that I know the paediatricians know well, but talking a bit about adult medicine too. So I want you to be confident at the end of this talk on how to detect hypoxaemia. I want you to also be confident in the use of pulse oximetry and monitoring of oxygen therapy. I want you to understand oxygen concentrators and how they work and how to use and maintain them. And I want you to understand how to maintain oxygen concentrators and to use a device I'll show you called an oxygen analyzer. First of all, I want to show you three very short videos. And the reason I'll just admit some people as we go. The reason I want to show you these videos is because I think that they prove just how effective oxygen therapy can be. And I want you to just watch this small baby first. This was a small baby up in Mount Hagen some years ago. I'll just show you this baby and just watch the video. Now you'll be familiar with how to look at an a pulse oximeter and see what number it reads, but perhaps someone can tell me what oxygen saturation this small baby has. What was the oxygen saturation of this baby?
51. 49,
yeah, that's right, 51 to start with, and then the saturation went down, didn't it? And did you notice? I want you to notice something else about the baby. At the start, the baby's awake, and then the baby's coughing and seems a little bit upset. And then you think maybe the baby's oximetry is just low because the baby's coughing. But then you notice as the video goes on, the baby falls asleep and becomes actually unconscious. And that's because the oxygen saturation is very low. And even when the baby's settled, the oxygen saturation stays low. Just what, oh, sorry, I'll just show you again. Just watch, the baby's awake and coughing, but looks a bit, maybe if you look closely, a bit cyanosed, although it's hard to tell. The baby's saturation is 51, 52, heart rate of about 125. And then the baby becomes very sleepy and drifts off. You can see the chest in drawing the baby has, and then the saturation is 49. Okay, I want you to watch this next video because the next video was taken about a minute later, no more than a minute later. What do you notice about the baby?
More alert.
She's more alert, isn't she? She's awake and she's got her eyes open and she's quite alert now. That's right. And her oxygen saturation is what?
98.
98, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And I want you to see this third video shows you why the baby is like that. I mean, I'm sure you know, but I just think it's interesting to see why. And so this baby is alert. This was just taken a minute later, and this baby was receiving just half a litre of oxygen, half a litre of oxygen per minute by an oxygen concentrator. And this just shows you that in the first picture, in the first video, the baby was probably, if you have a saturation less than 50%, you're probably about an hour or so away from becoming completely unconscious and dying. And just with a little bit of oxygen, just half a litre of oxygen, the baby is then awake, is not hypoxic anymore, is alert, and is fine. So it just shows you how important oxygen is. And sometimes people think a baby with an oxygen saturation less than 50, oh, you'd have to put the baby on a ventilator. You'd have to do something like that. Well, you don't. You just have to give the baby some oxygen. Okay. All right. I think you guys know those things, but I wanted to just emphasize it for, for teaching purposes. I think it's very, a good instruction of why oxygen works. When we're thinking about COVID-19 and oxygen, this is in a way for the people who be working with adults who have COVID-19, and many of you have done that already. I think it's important that we think that as well as COVID-19, there are some other things that can cause hypoxemia, pneumonia or bronchiolitis from any cause, asthma in adults, chronic bronchitis or bronchiectasis, tuberculosis in people of all ages, heart failure in people of all ages. In children, it's quite common to have hypoxemia from upper airway obstruction, such as croup or a foreign body. And in other wards, in surgical wards, in emergency departments, trauma is a common cause of hypoxemia, low oxygen level. And that can be because of lung contusion or pneumothorax or hemothorax. And then there's other causes of hypoxemia in adult and pediatric wards, HIV-related pneumonia, for example, or even neurological catastrophes like strokes or meningitis or seizures. They can also be associated with hypoxemia and sometimes even malaria. So I guess if you think about all of these different diseases can cause hypoxemia, can cause low oxygen levels, we have to be experts in the use of oxygen. So that's another reason why, pediatricians, adult physicians, anyone, obstetricians, emergency physicians, we have to be experts in the use of oxygen. I wanted just to say that an oxygen system is not just having a cylinder. Some people think it's just, you need a cylinder and you need a mask. No, well, it's way more than that. You need a lot more equipment, basic equipment, to actually have a proper system, right? You can give oxygen with just a cylinder and a mask, but it's better to have a proper system. And this outlines the system that has been supported by the World Bank and DFAT and the National Department of Health have bought 320 oxygen concentrators, and they've bought nasal prongs to go with it, and pulse oximeters, which I'll explain a bit more about. And so really you need a proper system. You don't just need the equipment, you need a system, and you need, of course, you need reliable power, and you need proper training, and you need guidelines in the use of oxygen, and you need people who can maintain the oxygen concentrators, the oxygen equipment. You need a way of replacing them, and you need some sort of auditing or monitoring of the use of oxygen. I wanted to go back to the way we detect hypoxemia, and if we look at children who have hypoxemia, the clinical signs of hypoxemia are a little bit different, but I've tailored this list more to what you see with adults. Adults who have hypoxemia are breathing in a very difficult way, aren't they? They're often using their accessory muscles to breathe. They're using the muscles of their neck and their accessory muscles to breathe, and they have an inability to talk. I mean, many children can't talk in full sentences. Infants can't talk in full sentences, but if you look at an adult who's hypoxic, then they rarely can talk properly. They can't talk in full sentences. They may be cyanosed. They may have chest indrawing, although that's a bit less common in adults than it is in children. We see much more chest indrawing in children and young children. They might have head nodding. So you look at an adult or a child who's got hypoxemia, and they're breathing with their accessory muscles, and often they're nodding their head and they're grunting. And they may have apnea or gasping. Now, some of these are very late signs, and I think we need to get good at identifying hypoxemia in children and adults when they start to have the first signs. So the use of accessory muscles and difficulty talking, they're really early signs. But often using clinical signs, it's actually very difficult to detect hypoxemia. And this was a small baby that we saw on a ward round. And I just want to show you, the baby looks like the baby's just sleeping, a little bit like that other one. But what can you see there? What's the oxygen saturation? It's a very brief video, but I'll just show you the oxygen saturation. What is it?
33.
33, exactly. And if you look at the baby's just breathing a bit fast and looks a little bit cyanosed, but the mother didn't realize the baby was very sick, and the doctors on the ward round didn't realize the baby's very sick. And that was because the baby had become so hypoxic that she had fallen asleep. And when she'd fallen asleep because of hypoxia, and like their previous baby, she was probably only an hour or so away from having an arrest. So we need to be identifying children and adults early, not waiting until they're this sick. But and the best way to do that is actually with pulse oximetry, because often the detection of hypoxemia with clinical signs can be quite difficult, especially in a dark hospital ward. You need a good light to identify hypoxemia. Now, as I said, we need to be experts in this equipment, and so I wanted to describe pulse oximetry and how it works, because I think we can all have a bit more understanding about how pulse oximetry works. It's fairly simple. I'll give you a very simple way of understanding it. You all know that this is a picture of the pulse oximeter I took just a little bit before, and here's an oximeter, and I'll just show you. You all know that the oximeter has a light, right? The oximeter has a light. We'll just turn it on. And the light emits two types of two frequencies of light. It just looks red, doesn't it? You look at the light and it just looks red. But there's two frequencies of light in this. And one of those frequencies of light is detected by oxygenated hemoglobin. So hemoglobin that has oxygen connected to it. And the other wavelength of light is detected by hemoglobin that doesn't have oxygen on it. And inside the oximeter is a computer, and inside in the computer has what's called an algorithm, which is just like a computer program that can look at the ratio between the red light and the blue light, if you like, and work out the proportion of hemoglobin, the red blood cells that carry oxygen. So I think they're the main things to remember, that the oximeter emits 2 wavelengths of light, and one is absorbed by oxygenated hemoglobin with oxygen, and the other one's absorbed by hemoglobin without oxygen. And the way the computer inside the oximeter works it out is just a proportion of the oxygenated to the deoxygenated hemoglobin, and that tells you the percentage of the hemoglobin in the blood that has oxygen on it. Most of the oxygen we carry in the blood is carried by hemoglobin. The important things about, I'll just turn my oximeter off for the moment. The important things about oximetry are that you have to use the right size probe. I think you all know that, but it's really important that you use an adult probe for an adult and a children's probe for a child and a neonatal probe for a neonate. You can try the wrong size probe, but you get a much better reading if you use the right size probe. In these oximeters, you can set the alarm limits. I could show you that if you like. These oximeters, which I hope are the type that have been bought by the Department of Health, they have a lithium-ion battery. So it's not like the normal batteries you buy at the shops. These ones you don't need to replace. I'll just show you the battery inside it. You just take it apart like this, right? And in the back, you just take this off. Okay, and there's the battery inside, right? And that's not your normal battery. That's a rechargeable lithium-ion battery. So you don't need to replace it. And the first thing is you don't need to replace it. The second thing is you always should recharge it when it's not in use. Now, some oximeters have a problem called movement artifact. I'll just show you again. Movement artifact is when a child or a patient moves a lot, then sometimes you don't get a very good reading. These types of oximeters, the ones that I've just shown you, they have I'll just admit a couple of people as we go. They have an inbuilt computer that allows for movement artifact, all right, which means that even if you're moving your probe, I'll just maybe stop sharing now for the moment. Even if you're moving your finger, right? I can be moving my finger a lot. It detects it, but the oxygen saturation is just the same, all right? And so it's got a program in it that stops movement artifact. The other problem, I'll just share my screen again. The other problem that sometimes, the other problem that sometimes you see is if a patient is in shock or is cold, then poor perfusion can lead to a poor reading. And in that circumstance, if the patient's got any of the clinical signs of hypoxaemia, you should just give them oxygen. And if you can warm the limb, that's a useful thing to do too, because then you'll get a good reading. So just to be clear, for those who are not that familiar with oxygen pulse oximetry is it tests the normal oxygen saturation of hemoglobin that circulates in the blood, and we sometimes call that the SpO2, which just stands for the arterial oxygen saturation, oxygen saturation measured by pulse oximetry. If you're for some people who are emergency physicians or intensive care physicians, you might also understand that SaO2, that's the arterial oxygen saturation you can measure by taking some arterial blood. But this is pulse oximetry is a non-invasive way, and it's just as accurate as measuring arterial blood. In some cases, it can be even more accurate. And the SpO2 is the pulse wave through the minor arteries, the small arterioles in the digit. So the SpO2 is the oxygen saturation. Our normal SpO2 is 95 to 100% at sea level. And if you go up into the highlands, then your oxygen saturation is a little bit lower. And we know that at least among children, the oxygen saturation is around about 93 to 96% in in newborn babies up to the first 2 years of life. After that, it becomes a bit more like adults. And even in the highlands, most adults have oxygen saturations that are sort of around about 95, 96, even up to 100%. So you adapt to the low oxygen levels, to the low partial pressure of oxygen in the highlands. You adapt to it over time, but it can take a year or two. The main thing is to know, to teach nurses and other healthcare workers what the normal saturation is, teach them what the SpO2 stands for, and teach them how to get a good oxygen reading using the right size probe and waiting 15 to 30 seconds until you get a steady state waveform before you take the recording. When children and adults have pneumonia, it's useful to know just how long they're hypoxic for. And this is important because it can indicate just how much oxygen we need. And if we sorry, is it possible to for people to mute their device?
And now we'll do that just a little expansion.
If it's possible, could you just put yourself on mute so that we don't have the background noise? Thank you. Thank you. It's important to know just how long. It's important to know just how long patients are hypoxic for, because that will tell us how long we need oxygen for. And if you just use an oxygen cylinder, then on an average child, oh, I'm sorry, there's someone who's got their device still going, and it's a bit hard to. I'm hearing a lot of. That's all right. Thank you. As I was saying, it's important to know just how long a patient will be hypoxic for, because if you use a cylinder, for example, and a cylinder typically in most patients lasts around about 2 to 3 days, then if a child's got severe pneumonia, often they will need oxygen for 3 to 4 days, and a cylinder won't be sufficient. Even if they've got moderate pneumonia or bronchiolitis, then typically about 1 to 2 days, but often their symptoms last for a bit longer. If they're in the highlands, then we know that the hypoxaemia lasts for even longer, 4 to 8 days, typically for children who've got severe pneumonia. And for adults who've got COVID, for the adults that we look after with COVID, often their hypoxemia can last for 1 to 3 weeks. If they get a proper COVID pneumonia, then their hypoxemia can last for something like 1 to 3 weeks. So that would use a lot of oxygen cylinders. And that's why oxygen concentrators are probably a preferred way of giving oxygen, because they're inexhaustible. They won't run out as long as you've got a good oxygen supply. I wanted also to say that when there's the duration of hypoxemia and what the implications of that are. Sometimes people would think, oh, if a patient's got hypoxemia that's lasting for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then they probably won't survive. That's actually not true. I'll tell you about this study. And this was a study of over 1,000 children who had severe pneumonia, and unfortunately 65 of those children died. This was in Goroka years ago. But what we did was look at how long children were hypoxic for. How long were they hypoxic for? And after 10 days, then 212 or 19%, right? That's a lot of children. 212 children were still hypoxic, and 83% of them still survived. So these children were hypoxic for longer than even their antibiotics needed to last. You give antibiotics for a week or maybe 10 days in a child with very severe pneumonia, but some of them, 212 of them, had hypoxia for even longer, but most of them survived if you just gave them enough oxygen. And children who were hypoxic for more than 20 days, there were 76 of those, and 83% survived. Still very high survival rates. And even some children, 39 of those 1,000 children, had hypoxia for more than 30 days. And if you gave them enough oxygen, 84% of them survived. So very high survival rates, despite very prolonged hypoxia. So don't let people tell you just because they've got hypoxemia for a long time means they can't survive. They can survive if you give them enough oxygen for a long enough time and look after them in other ways. So when should you use pulse oximetry? Well, I think that pulse oximeters should be used to monitor every patient at admission with respiratory signs or emergency signs, not just those children who've got pneumonia, because there are other conditions that are associated with hypoxemia. I think we should have a pulse oximeter on the ward round, and we should monitor every child who's on oxygen. And as you know, children can be monitored while they're on oxygen to make sure that the amount of oxygen you're giving them is enough. And also you can take children off oxygen and see if they still need the oxygen. Any patient who deteriorates with respiratory distress or apnea or any respiratory signs or even decreased conscious state, you should check their oximetry to see if they're hypoxic. There's some tricks to getting a good oxygen saturation reading on in small children, because it's a bit harder in small children. In adults, they just lie there and let you do their oxygen saturation. But for small children, then sometimes it's important to have the baby in the mother's lap, but don't take the baby out of the mother's arms and put the baby on the bed if they're crying. It's best if you let the baby be nursed in the mother's lap. And sometimes it's useful to allow the baby to feed on the mother's breast if they haven't got too much respiratory distress. Then that's a useful thing to check their saturation while they're feeding. You need to use the correct size probe, and you can calm or distract a child and check their saturation. And if their limbs are cold, then you should, as I said, put them on oxygen, because if they're in shock, they need oxygen. And also by warming their limbs, you can sometimes get a better oxygen saturation reading. Now, I think this is especially important for those who are looking after adults with COVID, but also for all of us who are looking after children and other adults with other conditions, because it's really important we know that some patients are more susceptible to hypoxemia. And as you know, hypoxemia can lead to really cellular death and organ failure. But some people are more susceptible than others. And so I want you to remember 4 different types of patients that are susceptible. Firstly, those people who've got a severe anemia. Remember that oxygen gets carried in hemoglobin, and if you've got a low hemoglobin level, then you don't have that much carrying capacity for oxygen. So if you've got severe anemia, then you'll be at risk of hypoxemia. If a patient's got heart failure, that's a big risk. Heart failure, diabetes, hypertension, all the types of conditions that we know put a patient at risk of severe COVID, then those people are more susceptible to hypoxemia. So I give oxygen at a lower threshold, if you like, than for other people. If they're in shock, then they're more susceptible to hypoxemia. It's a bit like having heart failure, reduced cardiac output and oxygen delivery. And if they've got reduced conscious state, then those people definitely need oxygen to their brain, don't they? You need to make sure that they're getting oxygen to their brain. So reduced conscious state or seizures, I have a lower threshold for giving oxygen. So for most children, we say that if the saturation is less than 90%, most children with bronchiolitis or pneumonia, we say that if the SpO2 is less than 90%, we'll give them oxygen. If for some reason you don't have pulse oximetry with you, then any child or adult who's got central cyanosis or nasal flaring or inability to drink or talk because of respiratory distress or grunting with every breath, you should always give them oxygen. Even if you don't have a pulse oximeter, just give them oxygen. And if patients, I think this is the important bit, if patients have some additional serious problem like emergency signs or anemia or heart failure or shock or reduced conscious state, then you should give them oxygen, even if their saturation is, in the low 90s, because they're a bit more susceptible to oxygen, to hypoxemia than other patients. And so I have a lower threshold for giving those patients oxygen. The flow rates we use, I think, will be familiar to you. So neonates, 0.5 to 1 litre. Remember that infant I showed you earlier on, she just needed 0.5 litre of oxygen. But some young infants who've got severe pneumonia, they may need 1 to 2 litres per minute in the first 12 hours of their treatment. And older children, they may need up to 2 to 4 litres per minute. And adults, they may need 2 litres per minute, or sometimes 4 litres per minute, or even up to 8 litres per minute. And this is very important. And it's important because of how much oxygen you need to give, and the types of oxygen concentrators that will be most effective. And I think this factored a lot into our thinking about the best type of oxygen concentrator to buy for the pandemic. And so what we've bought are the 10 litre per minute oxygen concentrators. They're concentrators that will be very familiar to many of you, but they run at 10 litres per minute. So an adult can easily be managed with an oxygen concentrator like that. The previous ones that we had were only up to 5 litres per minute. And for some people, particularly older children and adults, they need a bit more oxygen. So you can run them a bit higher. Okay. How often do you check oximetry in patients? Well, I said that which children need oximetry, but I think you should monitor the SpO2 after starting oxygen, because you want to know that their saturation has come back up above 90%. I always monitor a child within 15 minutes of starting oxygen. I usually try to do it as I'm giving oxygen, and then at least 3 times a day. But sometimes, you know, the sicker they are, the more frequently you monitor them, sometimes even up to hourly, or even try to do it continuously if you've got a very sick patient that is slow for the oxygen saturation to come up. Now, the question often arises as to what to do if the patient's oximetry is still low after giving oxygen. And it's a good reading, but the oximetry is still low. The patient's still hypoxic. Well, the first thing to do is check the machine. And so you can check that the oxygen is flowing properly, and I'll show you how to do that at some stage, and that there's no leaking from the tubing. You can check the nasal prongs are fitted correctly and they're not sort of up above the nostrils. You can check that the concentrator is delivering more than 85% oxygen, and I'll show you how to do that when I turn on the concentrator behind me. You can then check the patient. So there's 3 things you can do first up, just to check the machine, because sometimes it can be a problem with the machine. Check the patient. So you check for upper airway obstruction, or check for some other condition like pleural effusion or a pneumothorax the child might have or the patient might have. And check the patient's making a good effort to breathe. If you've got a patient who's not breathing well, if they're breathing too slowly, then giving them oxygen, it might make them start to breathe faster. But if they've got a serious problem that they're in respiratory failure, what we call type 2 respiratory failure, then sometimes they will still, just giving them oxygen won't be enough, and they need a bit extra support with their ventilation. So the 3 things you should do: 1, check the machine; 2, check the patient; and 3, then escalate. You can give a higher flow of oxygen. So, you know, give up to 4 litres a minute in a child, or 8 litres per minute in an adult, or you can give CPAP, and you should communicate with someone someone more senior, or get someone else to see the patient. I mean, in most hospitals we have alert monitoring and response charts, where if a patient is still hypoxic, then there'll be a response, like a medical emergency team, and that might be just calling someone else to come and see the patient, an emergency physician, or the pediatrician, or the person in charge, come and get them to see the patient. And I think we need to get into more of a habit about this emergency response to a deteriorating patient. I could talk more about that later. Okay, I want to talk a bit now about how oxygen concentrators work, because, as I say, we should try to be experts in this, in how oxygen concentrators work. And I think some of this will be known to many of you, but I want to go through the technical aspects of how oxygen concentrators work, so we're all experts, all right? So I know you know that the air we breathe is 21% oxygen. It's it's 78% nitrogen. So most of the air we breathe is nitrogen, and then it's 1% just rare gases like argon. Well, a concentrator, it takes atmospheric air, entrains the atmospheric air into the back of the concentrator, and then removes nitrogen. That's what it does. It removes this 78% nitrogen. So it concentrates up oxygen. It makes more pure oxygen, if you like. And what you get is more than 90% oxygen. And it works by this process called pressure swing adsorption. And the only reason to know what this process is called is because when you hear an oxygen concentrator work, it sounds a little bit like this sometimes. And that's what you hear, the noise the concentrator making is called pressure swing adsorption. And I'll try to explain what that is. It's where the oxygen concentrator is moving between the cylinders inside the concentrator to push air into one of the cylinders to absorb the nitrogen and then make oxygen. And then it moves to the other cylinder and it removes the nitrogen to make oxygen, and then it moves back to the other one. I'll show you with some, I'll take the back off the concentrator and show you. A concentrator works a little bit like this. I've just done this schematic diagram, and the air comes in at the back mostly, and it comes in through a coarse filter. I'll explain that and show you that. It comes in through a coarse filter, and then it goes in through this intake filter and goes through a compressor. Now, the compressor is just a pump. That's all it is a pump inside. And it's just like any other sort of pump that you would have, a pump for the tires on your car or the pump for any sort of pump. And then it goes through a heat exchangers, which means that a little bit of the moisture is removed from the air that we breathe. And then it goes through some valves. The valves are quite important because the valves direct the flow of gas to one of the cylinders. I'll show you the cylinders, and then to the other cylinder. So one and then the other, and it moves backwards and forwards. About every 5 seconds, it moves backwards and forwards. And then that removes the nitrogen, and then it goes through what's called some other valves, and then it goes into what's called a product tank, which is really just an oxygen tank within it. And then there's a pressure regulator, which regulates the amount of pressure and flow. Then it goes through the last filter and then comes out and can go to the patient. And there's 5 main parts to an oxygen concentrator I want you to have some familiarity with. And the reason I explain them is because if something goes wrong with the concentrator, it's usually one of these 5 things. And for some of them, we need, as doctors and nurses, health workers, we need to have a good understanding of so that we can do some basic maintenance. And for some things, the biomedical technologists will be they'll do the basic maintenance and replace some of these parts. So the 5 parts that I want you to know about, very simply, the compressor, the valves, what's called the sieve beds, or I sometimes think of it as cylinders, but they're not like oxygen cylinders, but I'll show you what they look like. Then there's a circuit board, which is just like a small computer inside the concentrator. And then the filters, which we sort of know about some of them, and we have to replace some of them. The compressor is, like I said, just a pump that pushes air from the room into the sieve beds. The sieve beds are I'll explain what they are, but they're where the nitrogen gets extracted. And the reason to know about the compressor is that there's a couple of parts in the compressor that can wear over time. And when they wear out, then the concentrator won't be producing as good a concentration of oxygen. And the 2 parts within the compressor that sometimes wear out are called the cup seals. And the compressor is like a compressor in your car. It's got pistons and it has cup seals inside, and it's also got bearings, like bearings in the wheel of your car, in brakes of your car, and they can wear out over time because they're moving all the time. Sometimes the concentrator then makes a bit more noise than it should, and sometimes you'll be able to detect a problem with the compressor because there's a low oxygen concentration being produced by the concentrator. So the compressor is one thing. The second part is the valves. And the valves, as I said, they control the flow of gas that comes in, is pumped by the compressor, and it goes from one of the sieve beds to the other sieve bed. So it goes at one for say 5 seconds, and then moves to the other one. And that movement of gas is controlled by the valves. And the reason why, the only reason to explain about the valves inside an oxygen concentrator is sometimes the valves get a bit sticky, or they get a bit dirty. And it's very important that we keep an oxygen concentrator clean. If you don't keep it clean, then dust and dirt or particles can get into the concentrator, and they can lead to the valves getting stickier. And if they're sticky, then the gas doesn't move through the concentrator like it should. The valves then become noisy, so the concentrator makes more noise, and also it can lead to a reduced concentration of oxygen being produced by the machine. The third part is probably the most important part, and I've taken the back off a concentrator to show you this. These are the main parts of a concentrator, and they're called the sieve beds. They look like cylinders, but they're inside them. They've got a special crystal, and the crystals are called zeolite crystals, and they're unique crystals because they can absorb nitrogen under pressure. When the compressor is blowing gas into the sieve beds, when it's coming down here and blowing into this sieve bed, then nitrogen absorbs or sticks to the crystals, and that means that oxygen can go all the way through. And that means when the gas is flowing into this one's making pure oxygen, and then the gas then flows out, and then the machine turns to the other one, and gas flows through here and makes pure oxygen. So the pressure alternates between one sieve bed and the other sieve bed, and that's why the concentrator makes the alternating noise that you hear. Inside the concentrator, the fourth thing is the circuit board, or just a mini computer. This is one from the types of 10-liter concentrators that I said we bought for the pandemic. And it's a computer. It's a small computer inside, and I mean, biomedical technologists know about these computers. Health workers don't have to know anything, but just to know that when you if there's something wrong with the concentrator, then there are some lights in this circuit board that can go on, and they can tell you, for example, which valve is it, the valve before the cylinders or after the cylinders that's wrong, and some lights come on to tell you that. It's quite a clever computer, which a trained biomedical technologist can look at the computer and say where the problem is within the concentrator. And the last thing is the fifth thing are the filters. And the one I suppose that you're familiar with is the external filter on the machine. And I'll just take it out of this one here. This is just the external coarse particle filter. You know about these, and they get changed every week. These are very important because the hospital wards, they should be clean, but they're not always clean, and they have some dust and some dirt and just floating in the air. But these absorb a lot of the coarse particles in the air. That's the first one. I'll explain how to change them. Inside there's two more filters. This is really useful because they're internal filters that filter any very microscopic particles. The internal filter needs to be changed only every 5,000 hours of use, and the biomedical technologists know how to change this. This is easy to change, but it's inside. And then there's one more filter, which is even it filters out even more microscopic particles, and that is called the product filter. After the product tank I showed you before, there's a product filter just before the oxygen gets delivered to a patient. There's no need to change that. That will last for the life of the concentrator. There's a fourth filter that sometimes we've been putting on oxygen concentrators. I don't think they're absolutely necessary, but we have bought some for the concentrators that are being used in the pandemic, and they're a very, very fine viral filter. In fact, they filter off 99.999 more than that viral particles. I don't think, even without these, that there's very much of a risk of COVID getting into a concentrator at all, actually, as long as you keep it really clean, and I'll explain how to clean it. But an additional viral filter is sometimes being used. Okay, a bit more about concentrators and how you set them up in the ward. It's very important. Where you put a concentrator in the ward is very important. You need to have it close to a power outlet, of course. It should be in the cool part of the ward, not in direct sunlight or in a warm in a area close to a heater or a heat source of any sort. Keep it away from curtains. A concentrator needs to breathe. It's bringing in air from the outside. So it should be at least 1.5 meters away from any source of heat and 30 centimeters, so 1 foot away from any wall. You need to give it space to breathe. The ward should be well ventilated. And from the start of the pandemic, I've thought that wards should just install exhaust fans that remove the air to the outside. I think that would be a good thing to do. Exhaust fans are fairly cheap, and if there was one close to any concentrator, that could help quite a lot. Now, okay, now the practical things. I'm just going to, yeah, I think you can probably see this concentrator here. Can you all see the concentrator? I want to go through some key things about starting a concentrator and what you need to teach other people. The first thing about starting a concentrator is that when you start it, there's an alarm that sounds, and that alarm tells you whether the power is connected or not. Right? I'll just turn it on. So you heard the alarm, and that alarm tells you whether the power is connected. And if the alarm continues, if it hadn't stopped when we turned it on, that would have suggested that the power was not connected properly, or the power source was not good enough. All right. So you need to listen for the power alarm to go off. The second thing is that before you start a concentrator, this is very important. Before you start the concentrator, you have to have the flow meter turned on. And so, did you notice that on this one, the flow meter is turned on? Now, the reason to have the flow meter turned on is so that the concentrator doesn't start working against an obstruction, and the obstruction would be if you don't have flow coming out here. So if you've got the flow meters turned off, then the power inside the machine is actually pushing against an obstruction, and that can damage the machine. So the simple thing is teach people to turn the flow meter on first before you turn the power switch on. The amber light, maybe I'll just actually stop sharing and just show you the concentrator. If you can see this, this amber light here, can you see that? I'll just move it closer. I think most of you are familiar with this, but there's a small light here that's come on. That's an amber light on most concentrators. This small light. Now that comes on whenever you turn a concentrator on, and that tells you that there's a battery inside the concentrator which is still working. It also indicates that the power is on. But the real reason for this light is to see whether the concentrator is producing enough oxygen. All right? If the light stays on, then the concentrator is not producing enough oxygen. Now it sometimes takes 2 to 5 minutes for that light to go off. Sometimes takes 2 to 5 minutes for that light to go off. But when the light goes off, it tells you that the concentrator is producing enough oxygen. Okay, so at the moment that light's still on. So my concentrator at the moment is not producing more than 85% oxygen, and that's just because it takes time for the concentrator to it takes time for the concentrator to build up to be producing high concentration oxygen. But you'll see that light will go off shortly. I'll just share my screen again. So that's the light. You need to teach people about that. If the alarm sounds continuously, if you hear that same alarm continuously, then there's something wrong with the power. Either the power is not connected or the power is not reaching the machine. Sometimes it can be unplugged. Sometimes there could be irregular power. Yeah, but sometimes if the alarm sounds intermittently, like that same sound I showed before, if it sounds alarms intermittently, then sometimes it can be a defective circuit board inside or some electrical problem inside or a problem that needs the biomedical technologist to deal with. If it's constant, then I think we can deal with it. We can check the power and that sort of thing. Yeah? As I say, if there's an intermittent sounding of the alarm, and sometimes it can be a leak in the internal tubing, that's the most common reason. And I found that a very easy problem to solve. The biomedical technologist can just reconnect the tubing. It's quite easy to do. Or sometimes it can be a more difficult problem of the internal parts of the sieve beds or the solenoid, the valves or the compressor. And so we need to be like, you need to diagnose what the problem is when you hear an alarm, and not allow a concentrator to become malfunctioning, but detect it early. I'll just touch on routine maintenance. I talked before about the where's that? Oh yeah, where's the coarse particle filter? Every week you have to take one out, clean it, just wash it in soap and water, and then replace with a dry one. So you need 2 of these, and for each concentrator you need at least to have 2 of these, so you can swap them around 1 week and swap the other one over. You wash it in some detergent or an antiseptic, rinse thoroughly, allow it to dry. Don't put it in front of a heat source to dry, just allow it to dry naturally. That's the internal particle, the external particle, coarse particle filter. I think you should clean the concentrator every week because it can get dust on them. So I clean the exterior of the concentrator with an antiseptic, like 70% alcohol. We're used to using that, or 0.5% sodium hypochlorite, which is just bleach. It's a chlorine-based cleaning fluid that'll certainly clean any viral particles or any bacteria off the concentrator. And you wipe the surface with a damp cloth and some antiseptic, and then dry the concentrator. You should have a program of cleaning your concentrators regularly, every week at least. Have cleaning of them. As I said, you need to check the amber lights off 2 to 5 minutes after the concentrator turns on. You need to check there are no leaks in the oxygen tubing and the nasal prongs are properly cleaned. And you need to use an oxygen analyzer. Now that brings me to the oxygen analyzer. And I said that I'd explain what they are. I'll just show you. This is an oxygen analyzer. It looks a bit like a pulse oximeter, doesn't it? It looks a bit like a pulse oximeter, but it's not. It's an oxygen analyzer. And these devices are very important. If you've got an oxygen concentrator, then I think you really need to have an oxygen analyzer. And there are some devices that are not square like this or rectangular. They're circular. They're still the same. I'm not quite sure which ones everybody will have, but they do the same thing. And what they do is tell you whether the concentrator is producing good quality oxygen, enough oxygen, right? And what is this oxygen analyzer telling us the concentration of oxygen is? What does it tell us at the moment? Can you see?
20.8.
Yeah, good. That's right, 20.8%. And why do you think it's 20.8%?
Atmospheric air.
Atmospheric air, very good. And that's right, because it's just, I've got the tubing on, but it's not connected up to anything. And can you see the second number below the oxygen concentration, which is 20.8 or 20.9? What's the number below it? What does that say?
0.
Yeah, 0.0. And what that tells you is that that's the flow rate. All right, the flow rate. And at the moment, this oxygen analyzer is not on any flow. It's just open to air, so there's no flow through it. It's just measuring atmospheric air. Okay, and so that's when you turn an oxygen analyzer on, that's what it should measure. It should measure something like 21% or 20.9%, and something like 0 because it's not attached to any flow. All right. Now I'm just going to show you how to use an oxygen analyzer. It's very, very easy. And I'll just turn my concentrator on again. And you notice that the amber light is still on. Okay, the amber light's still on because I've just turned it on again. So it might take a little while for the amber light to come off. But in the meantime, I'm just going to attach up the oxygen analyzer to the concentrator. We'll just attach it up, just plug it in there. And okay, and just watch what it's reading. Can you see that?
Sure. It's going up.
Yeah, it's going up, isn't it? Yeah. And at the moment, what are we up to? It's
49.5 and 4.9 the low.
Yeah, 5.
So it's taking a little while. Oops. Taking a little while for it to come up. Remember I said when you first turn on your concentrator, it won't be making air. It'll be making something more than air, but it sometimes takes a little while for the oxygen concentration to come up to, remember I said it takes 2 to 5 minutes for the oxygen concentration to come up to more than 85%. And you'll find when it comes up to 85, then the amber light will go off. So if you had a very sick patient, then and you had and what you had was an oxygen concentrator, when you turn it on, even now, if you were to give them 60% oxygen, that would still be good. That would be much better than their 21% oxygen that they're breathing, wouldn't it? And so you can see it's up to what, 68, 69% now, and that's after a couple of minutes. You just wait and it'll be even higher. Now it's going up quite fast, 72%, 73, 74. It's going up quite fast now. But so if I've got a sick patient, I'm happy to start using the oxygen concentrator almost right away, because you know that the amount of oxygen they're getting is more than 21%. It's going up and up and up. And what you've got to do is use an oxygen analyzer every week to check your concentrator so that you've got confidence that it's producing high quality oxygen. It should be producing more than 85% oxygen, and mostly we'll see what it gets to. Now it's 85%. And did you notice, just look at the concentrator, the amber light has just gone off, right? And that's because it's producing more than 85% oxygen. But we'll see how high it gets to. It'll probably plateau out around about 93% oxygen, okay? So when you're treating a patient, you don't have to use the oxygen analyzer before you start treating the patient. What you should do is use it every week to make sure the concentrators that you have are functioning really well, okay? Now this one at the moment is producing what, 91% oxygen. So that's high concentration oxygen, right? After another few minutes, I'll just leave it down for a bit and we'll see what it gets to. I'll just leave it down. Okay. I'll share my screen again. Okay. Just a couple of things about oxygen safety. I think this is very important that we teach other people about oxygen safety. It's very, very important that no one smokes around an oxygen concentrator and there's no fires, because that can cause you know, a serious fire. If you, as you know, fires like oxygen, and so that can cause, you know, combustion and a serious fire. Also, you should have no oil or grease or kerosene or petroleum-based products around an oxygen concentrator. That's very dangerous. From an infection control point of view, sometimes I see people with they've got their oxygen prongs, and they hook them up to the oxygen concentrator, and then they just leave them in the bed on the bed sheets. And that's a serious problem, because that's a real infection risk. You know, mostly the beds of our patients, they are likely to have the same bugs that the patients have. If the patient's got a multi-resistant organism or something like that on their skin, then their bed will have that as well. And so we really shouldn't leave medical equipment lying on the bed. It's a big infection risk. And we really need to know, for the purposes of infection control, we need to know how to clean oxygen equipment. This is very important, because we don't want to make patients sick with the, you know, with the equipment that we're using. And so how do you keep oxygen equipment clean? Well, you need to do 4 things. The first one is rinse it in soap and water. Secondly, soak it in dilute bleach solution, like that 0.5% sodium hypochlorite I mentioned. If you use very more concentrated bleach, you don't need to, but if you did, then sometimes that can make oxygen tubing disintegrate. So you just use a very dilute bleach. 0.5% is enough. I sent around a bit before a guideline on the use of oxygen therapy in COVID, and that has how to make up the 0.5% bleach from just household bleach. It's very easy to make up. And after you've soaked it in bleach, then you have to rinse off all the bleach, the chlorine residue, and then just allow it to dry. I think you guys know how to clean oxygen equipment and are really conscious of infection control procedures, but it is important. Now we'll just check our concentrator and see what we're up to. Okay, so this concentrator has made, like, can you see what it is?
Oh, 95%.
95%. Yeah. So that's a good, well-functioning, properly functioning oxygen concentrator will make about 95% oxygen. All right, and the reason to use the oxygen analyzer is to detect problems early, because if the concentrator is not making 85% oxygen, then we need to be identifying that early and trying to troubleshoot and making sure that we are doing all the right things in terms of keeping it clean and dry, etc. Okay. Now, look, finally, for some places, I want to talk a bit just very briefly about these flow meters, because they have some in children. When we're giving oxygen, in some hospitals, we've set up these flow meters, and the flow meter attaches to the concentrator. So the concentrator puts oxygen into the flow meter, and then that divides up the flow, and it can divide it up between 1 and 5 patients. And that means for a 10 litre per minute oxygen concentrator, you can perhaps give 2 litres per minute to 5 different children, or even 5 litres per minute to one, and 1 litre per minute to another, and 2 litres to another. And you can dial up an individualized flow. And I think that's the way we've set it up for children. I suspect for most uses of concentrators for adults who have COVID, then what we'll do is have 1-to-1, or at most 1-to-2 patients. So 1 concentrator to 2 patients, or 1 concentrator to 1 patient. Because as I said, most adults, if they've got bad COVID, they're going to need to have somewhere between 2 and 5 and up to 8 litres per minute. So it's important that we've got enough oxygen to give them to make sure their saturation stays above 90%. All right. Okay. And now there was one other thing I wanted to say about the care of oxygen concentrators, and I want to go back to my first slide actually, and explain what that is. And this, just to explain this, this was the picture on the first slide. This picture was taken in 2005, so now 16 years ago, and it was taken in Mendi, and it was taken when we first started using oxygen concentrators in PNG. And the reason this picture is important, I think, is because the maintenance man in Mendi did a very good thing. He made these stands for the oxygen concentrators. He made a stand. You can see his stand's got legs on it. He was a good craftsman. He made these stands. It's got a drawer in the front that you can put your oxygen equipment, the tubings and everything in. And this was very important because that means that the concentrator is up off the floor. So it's not getting dirty and dusty like the floor. So, and you can clean around it very easily. And I would encourage hospitals to make such stands. They have to be strong because the concentrator itself weighs 25 kilos. So it needs to be a fairly strong stand. But I think the reason why the concentrators in Mendi have lasted so long, and I was speaking to Dr. Martin Savu just on Friday, and he was telling me that these concentrators are still working even 16 years later. And so I think it's because they've been looked after very well by the healthcare workers in Mendi, that they're still working. So in some other places, they have broken down a bit earlier. And I think that a lot of that is because they haven't been maintained as well and haven't been looked after as well. And sometimes it's actually because the power supplies have damaged the concentrator, so the irregular power supplies, so that becomes an issue as well. Anyway, look, that's all I wanted to say today. I know this has been a bit different to our usual paediatric talk on a paediatric topic, but I wanted to, Dr. Scotty Candelio asked if I could do this talk again, and I thought it was important that we all become experts in oxygen concentrators. I'm going to stop recording now, if I can do that somehow. And anyway, stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to, where's recording? Oh, yes.